Hey everybody, Marcus here. A while back I was asked as to my opinion on the pickup artist community. Though I do have an opinion as to the subject, I believe it would be a lot more interesting to tackle the issue from a philosophical perspective and ask ourselves a philosophical question in relation to pickup artists. To get to the pertinent question, let us first take 3 assertions from the PUA community as our starting point. Firstly, pickup artists assert that they possess what they refer to as game. Secondly, that game is a skill you can learn. And thirdly, PUAs assert that they can teach game. If indeed it is the case that game is a skill or art, and that indeed it is teachable, then it follows that game is a form of knowledge. This follows from the second and third premise. From the first premise, namely that PUAs possess game, is a claim by PUAs to possess knowledge of a certain kind. Now, everything I have said so far, I posit, is not controversial, and any PUA should be happy to grant me as true. Now, the philosophical question that can be asked is this: is game an art and therefore a form of knowledge? All arts aim at an ends. For military science, the ends is victory. For shipbuilding, a ship. And for medicine, it is health. So, in this way, what is the ends at which game aims at? Well, surely if a PUA was pressed on the matter, he would say that the art of game aims at the acquisition of consent for sex with a woman. Now, I have heard several PUAs indicate that game is more than just about getting sex. Let us explore this claim. If it is the case that game is about more than acquisition of consent for sex, then it follows that there is another art whose aim is the acquisition of consent for sex, and game merely incorporates this other art, much in the way that military science, whose aim is victory, would incorporate the art of shipbuilding, but itself be not the art of shipbuilding. However, if it is the case that there is an art in acquisition of consent for sex that game merely incorporates, then it follows that this art can be extracted from game and studied independently of game and without the need for game. Let us posit that the aims of game is indeed the acquisition of consent for sex and see where this takes us. Now, much in the way that every art aims at an ends, every art also aims for the good of the ends for which it aims and not the artisan. Let us see what we mean by this. Imagine a doctor. The art of the doctor is medicine, and the ends of medicine is health. Now, most doctors charge a fee for their services and therefore benefit. Now, is a doctor considered a good doctor if he performs his art for free, and a bad doctor if he performs his art for money? Well, surely he is not. He is a good doctor if he practices medicine well, and a bad doctor if he practices medicine badly. Now, in this way, he is a good doctor if he reaches the aims of health, and a bad doctor if he does not reach the aims of health. Now, does a doctor practice medicine on himself or others? Surely he can do both. But when he practices medicine on others, is he aiming for medicine to improve his own health or the patient's health? Well, surely the patient's health. So, if our doctor improves the health of his patient and charges no money for it, he is still considered a good doctor and have practiced medicine well, even though there is no benefit to himself. So, in this way, the art of medicine aims at the good of that which it aims, and not for the benefit of the artisan. In this way, too, the art of shipbuilding is for the good of the ship, while the art of horse breeding for the good of the horse. Though an artisan may gain benefit by charging a fee for his services, that benefit would come about by another art, namely the art of money-making. But then, for the good of what does game's end of acquiring consent for sex aim? Well, I posit that the common answer would be for the good of the pickup artist. Let us see if this is true. If indeed this is true, then the pickup artist is in some way improved through acquiring consent for sex. Now, is it possible that the pickup artist, after acquiring consent for sex through game, then having had sex with the woman from whom he acquired consent, contracts an STD? Well, this is possible. And do we consider disease a bad thing? This too is true. So the pickup artist has not been improved by having acquired consent for sex, but in fact the opposite has happened. He has been diminished by having acquired consent for sex. Now, can an art, if practiced correctly, can in fact lead away from the good of its ends? Well, surely not. So clearly, the good for which the ends of game aim cannot be the pickup artist himself, for he can be diminished by having practiced game well. What about the good of women from whom he has acquired consent from? Would she be improved by the aims of game? If she contracts an STD from having given her consent, then clearly she has also been diminished by the aims of game. So, if the good for which the ends of game is not for the PUA or for the woman, then it must be for the good of sex itself. Now, let us see where this leads. Is it moral to have sex with a woman not having acquired her consent? Well, clearly this would be immoral as it is rape. Now, is rape a form of sex? This too is true. So, rape is a form of immoral sex. So it would seem that the good for which the ends of game ends must be for the improvement of sex, as consent transforms an immoral form of sex into a moral form of sex. As moral sex is better than immoral sex, then the act of sex has been improved through the ends at which game ends. But from this it would follow that knowledge of game would be the same as knowledge of consent, and a PUA is someone who knows what consent is and what consent is not. It would also follow that a non-PUA would not know what consent is and what consent is not. So every person who claims to know what consent is making a claim to possess knowledge of game. Now, this would mean that close to, if not 100% of people possess knowledge of game, and that these feminists who institute consent classes are in effect teaching game. Now, clearly this is not how the PUA community speaks about game. So it appears we must have made a mistake at what game aims at. If games aims at acquiring the consent of sex from a woman, then game is knowledge of when consent is given and when consent is not. As this is not what we consider the aims of game, then we must look for a better account of what game aims at. What if indeed the ends of game is not to acquire consent for sex, but the aims of game is to turn an absence of consent into the presence of consent, namely, the art of turning a no into a yes? Let us explore this possibility. Now, let us ask ourselves, if one set of methods can turn a no into a yes 50% of the time, while another method can turn a no to a yes 75% of the time, would we not consider the second method superior to the first method? Well, surely we would. And then, in this way, would we not consider a method that can turn a no into a yes 90% of the time superior to a method that turns a no into a yes 75% of the time? We would indeed. And if we follow this pattern, a method that turns a no to a yes 100% of the time would be better still? Well, indeed it would. But what about this? Would a method that turns a no into a yes 100% of the time in 1 hour's effort be better than a method that turns a no into a yes in 2 hours' effort? Well, this indeed would be true. So the best method would be a method that turns a no into a yes 100% of the time with no effort. Well, indeed, such a method would be best. And would then it not be the case that every other method is in fact worse? Well, it would. So it follows that if such a method existed, or one closest to this, then the art of game, if indeed it is turning a no into a yes, would it be mastery of this method? Well, it would. Now, does paying a prostitute instantly and in 100% of cases, or nearly in 100% of cases, turn a no into a yes? Well, indeed it does. But do PUAs teach men to go to prostitutes? No, they do not. So the ends of game cannot simply be turning a no into a yes, or PUAs are, well, very bad at the art of game. But you must be thinking to yourself, but Marcus, you are too clever by half. Though your method of paying prostitutes may indeed turn a no into a yes near, if not 100% of the time with no effort, your method will not work on 100% of women. To this, I must say, well, that I agree. Paying cash will not work on 100% of women if and only if all women are not prostitutes. Also, the ends of turning a no into a yes does not analytically entail effectiveness on 100% of women, in the same way as the art of shipbuilding does not entail that ships can be built of every material. However, let us be generous to our critic and take into account his claim. To do this, we will need to change the ends of game for a second time and say that game aims at turning a no into a yes in the case of all women. Now, this is easy to refute, as the case of a comatose woman would preclude the possibility of such an art. Comatose women neither give a no or a yes, but abstain from responding, and even if you take silence as a no, you will still never get a yes from a woman in a coma. So from this it follows that game, if it is an art, and indeed it seeks to turn a no into a yes, can never be effective on all women. But this was a trivial and silly detour, as we clearly do not have women of such type in mind. As such, let us change the ends of game again, and say that game aims at turning a no into a yes for all women who are capable of consenting. Let us see where this account leads. Let us go back to our example of the prostitute. If indeed the method for turning a no into a yes of a prostitute is to give her money, and this is the optimal method for this type of woman, but giving money is not a universal method for all women who can consent, then it follows that there are different types of women, and for each type there is a different optimal method. But will giving a prostitute money always work when she is off duty? Well, surely not. So too, there must be a different optimal method for a prostitute who is off duty than a woman of the same type who is on duty. From this, it follows that a woman of a type has more than one optimal method. This is a contradiction on the surface. To resolve it, we must include the temporal dimension. If we include the temporal dimension, then it can be said that even though there are different types of women, their type at any given time may vary, and as such, the method appropriate to the type they are at a given time may vary. But now comes the question. If game indeed is meant to turn a no into a yes for all women who can consent, would we not need to know all optimal methods for all types of women? And in addition to this, be able to determine the type of a woman at any given time? Well, indeed we would, because otherwise we could not claim to possess game. Now, let us assert that where a prostitute is of one type of woman, that a virgin is another type of woman. From our argument so far, it follows that a man who only knows the method to change a no into a yes for a prostitute does not possess game, nor does the PUA who only knows how to change a no into a yes for a virgin. If the prostitute and virgin are asserted as the only two types in existence, then the only type of man who can claim possessing knowledge of game is a man who can turn a no into a yes for both a virgin and a prostitute. The same example could be expanded to include types like shy girls, party girls, Asians, Catholics, or whatever types of PUA wishes to assert exist. Now, you might be saying to yourself, well, both men have game, but each have game for specific types. If this is true, then there are as many arts of game as there are types. If this is true, then game is not an art, and therefore not knowledge. There is potentially only game of prostitutes, game of virgins, game of shy girls, and so on. Now, let us for the moment assert that indeed there is no universal game, but merely game based on type, and see where that goes. If indeed this is true, and a man wishes to convert a no to a yes for the type of, say, prostitutes, then he would learn game of prostitutes. Now, in order for him to be able to successfully apply game for such a type, he would necessarily need to be able to identify the type of a woman as prostitute. So the question is, does the art of game of prostitutes include the ability to identify types of that kind? As this is not analytically part of the ends of game in our current definition, it can either be the case that identifying different types of women is its own art, or that identifying different types of women is part of game. Let us try and resolve this problem. Is it possible to recognize a shy girl without the ability to convert a no into a yes? I posit that it is. This means that identifying types of girls is a separate art from game. But this means that even if one possesses game for a certain type of woman, one does not necessarily possess the art of identifying such a girl. If a person possesses the art of game for a certain type, but does not possess the art of identifying that type, then it follows that a man may be applying a method on a girl that will not work, as the type he is applying to the girl differs from her actual type. So it would seem that to secure sex, game is insufficient, as it requires both the art of identifying the type of girl as well as knowledge of game for that type. However, this hiccup is not relevant to the overarching question of whether or not game is knowledge. Now, let us, for the sake of argument, assume that all PUAs possess the art of being able to identify all types of girls to 100% certainty. Of course, it may also be the case that to identify any given type is its own art, but let us ignore this for the sake of simplicity. Now, if we accept the premise that there is no unified game, but only game of Asians, game of shy girls, and so on, our asserted ends of game, namely converting a no to a yes for all women capable of consenting, is not knowledge. Let us clarify what we mean. Earlier we said that it may be possible for there to be an art called game of prostitutes, and that there may be an art called game of shy girls. In these two cases, prostitutes and shy girls constitute types. However, the ends of the art of game, unqualified, was turning a no into a yes for all girls that can consent. In this definition, all girls would be a type as well. From this, it follows that game would only be an art if there was a singular type for which game ends. This would imply a universal female category, qualified only by her ability to consent, for which there is an art that converts a no into a yes. So either we must change the ends of game again, or assume that there is a universal female type. In other words, that there is a universal female nature for which the art of game can convert a no into a yes if the girl in question has the capacity to consent. Let us posit that such a universal female nature does exist. As MGTOW, we already carry this conviction, and it would be unfair and illogical to deny it to PUAs. It would also be hypocritical to argue against such an assertion as MGTOW. So now we must once again look at what good the ends of game aim at. Is it the good of the PUA or the woman? Again, we can revert back to our earlier arguments about STDs and conclude that our new definition of game, namely converting a no into a yes for all girls who can consent, cannot be good for either the PUA or the woman. So it must be for the good of sex itself? Well, let's see. Now, earlier we argued that sex without consent is rape and therefore immoral. In our earlier definition of game, namely that game aims at acquiring consent for sex, we found out that game would then be knowledge of whether or not consent was given. Namely, to be able to recognize the answer to the question, has consent been given? So how is our new definition, converting a no into a yes, different? Well, clearly, the new definition implies knowledge of the question to ask. So it would seem that if the ends of game is to convert a no into a yes for all girls who can give consent, then game is knowledge of what question to ask that compels such consent. However, we have a bit of a problem here. Both our definitions of game seem to only be half the story. Where in the first definition we saw game as the knowledge to recognize consent, in the second definition we see game as knowledge of what question to ask to gain such consent. Clearly, we would need both. We would need to know what question to ask and then be able to recognize the answer. So, though under our first definition a PUA would recognize consent if he had acquired it, but not know how to ask for it, in our second definition, the PUA would know the question to gain consent, but he would be unable to recognize the answer. But this is all too confusing, so let me clarify. Is it not the case that sometimes consent can come through the word yes, while other times it can come through body language? Well, indeed, this is the case. And is it also the case that sometimes a verbalized no, if said sarcastically or playfully, can in fact imply a yes? Well, this too is the case. So, being able to tell the difference between a serious no and a sarcastic no is a form of knowledge? Well, this is true. And in this way, being able to recognize a yes through body language and a no through body language, is this also knowledge of a certain kind? Well, it is. So, our first definition of game would be knowledge of the kind we have just described, knowledge of recognizing a serious yes and a serious no. But in order to get a serious no, a serious yes, a sarcastic no, body language indicative of a no, or body language indicative of a yes, we must first ask the question of whether or not the woman wants to have sex, do we not? Well, indeed we do. First, we must ask the question. And does one way of asking the question sometimes yield a serious no, while other times it yields a serious yes? Well, indeed it does. So, under our second definition of game, it must be the case that game is the knowledge of asking the question that will yield a serious yes, or body language indicative of a serious yes. But this is still incomplete. Our second definition of game claims to convert a no into a yes. This implies that the question must be asked twice. The first time the question is asked, a serious no is received. And then, when the question is asked a second time, a serious yes is given. Now, if the ends of game under the second definition is indeed knowledge of the question that gets a serious yes, then why would someone possessing this knowledge need to ask the question twice? Either game under the second definition is knowledge of the question to get a serious yes, or it is not knowledge. If it is knowledge of the question that gets a serious yes, but the PUA must ask it twice, and on the first time asking gets a serious no, then either the PUA asks it badly the first time, or he does not possess the knowledge of the question to ask. Since it would be ridiculous to ask a question badly if one can ask it well, it follows that our second definition is internally incoherent. After all, what need would there be to convert a no into a yes if you possess knowledge of the question that yields a serious yes? There would be none. So if the ends of game is indeed to convert a no into a yes for all women that can consent, then game cannot be knowledge of the question that gets a serious yes, but must be the process of discovering the question, when asked, leads to a serious yes. However, if it is a process, and we have previously asserted that there is a universal human nature, then it follows that this process would only ever be followed once. After the process has been followed, knowledge of the question would emerge, and this question would always yield a serious yes. Now, if an art has a product as its result, then the product is always better than the method. In our case, the question that always yields a serious yes then becomes better than the method of attaining this question. As such, upon discovering the question that yields a serious yes, game would lose its purpose, as any repetition of the process would always lead to the same question. So, if game is indeed a method, then it is a method that was only ever needed to be completed once, by one person, and the question discovered could then be taught as knowledge to others. Now, what qualities would a question that yields a serious yes have if it were to count as knowledge? Well, it would be eternal, unchanging, and perfect. Namely, it would always yield a serious yes. If the question cannot meet these criteria, it cannot be knowledge. Now, we need to ask ourselves, does game make the promise that you will get a serious yes in all cases for all women able to consent? It does not. So either game is not knowledge, PUAs do not possess game, or game is not converting a no into a yes for all women who can consent. Since PUAs claim that they possess game and that game can be taught, and that which is teachable is knowledge, then it follows that game is not converting a no to a yes for all women who can consent. But perhaps we have gotten ahead of ourselves. Let us see if we can salvage the argument. Earlier, we had presented a disjunction. Our disjunction related to types of women. On one hand, we said that game is converting a no into a yes for a universal nature of woman, which we called all women. On the other hand of the disjunction, we said that there may be no game of all women, but game of prostitutes, game of shy girls, game of Asians, and so on. Would our argument fare better if we took that there is no singular game for all women, but only game per type of woman? Let us explore this option by starting with our prostitute example. Firstly, we must narrow our definition of game to reflect the type of woman involved. Let's assert that game of prostitutes is conversion of a no to a yes for the type of woman who is a on-duty prostitute and can consent. From this definition, we still succumb to the problem of asking the question twice and reducing game from knowledge to a method. So let us change the end to better reflect knowledge. Game of prostitutes then becomes asking the question that yields a yes for a type of woman who is a on-duty prostitute and can consent. If such a question exists and it meets our criteria for knowledge, then it is possible that game is knowledge for at least one type of woman. What about the question, will you consent to sex with me after I have paid you your asking rate? Would this question yield consent in 100% of cases? If we exclude the typical negotiations of price as related to particular sex acts. Now, the answer is no. It is very much in the realm of possibility that even if this question yields a serious yes in near to 100% of cases, the prostitute can still say no. And here we get to the crux of the problem. The prostitute has free will. She, along with every type of woman, no matter how one determines the type, is always in a position to refuse. From this, it follows that there can never be a question that meets the standard we have set for ourselves. If there is no question, then there is no method to determine such a question. From this it follows that there is no knowledge of converting a no into a yes for a type of woman who is a prostitute on duty and is able to consent. This conclusion also holds true for all other types of women, and therefore game of prostitutes, game of shy girls, game of any type cannot be knowledge. So, it seems we are forced to abandon all forms of arguments that involve converting a no into a yes, as they will all succumb to the same fate. In addition to this, due to the existence of free will, there is no knowledge of getting a serious yes to sex. This entails that no definition of game can be formulated to be classified as knowledge if we are to include any idea of pursuing sex. Now, a response I anticipate, goes as follows. Marcus, surely you are not saying that game cannot be used to improve your chances with getting sex with women. Even if game cannot be considered knowledge, you must see that it has some pragmatic benefit. Well, my response to this is simple. At no point in this video have I made any claims as to the effectiveness of game. I have not made the claim or argued for game having no effect. What I have done is evaluated the claims of the PUA who asserts game as knowledge. For the two definitions of game we have presented, game cannot be justified to be knowledge. Now, it is of course possible to offer other definitions of game. Let us briefly look at one of these alternative accounts. Let us assert that the ends of game is to turn a man into an alpha male. Let us also grant, without looking for a justification, that indeed this is true and possible. The question still left unanswered is whether or not someone ought to be an alpha male. In addition to this, the question for what an alpha male is has not been defined. Though I offer my own account of what an alpha male is in my video on alpha males, in this video I will merely assert that whatever an alpha male is, it is the correct definition of alpha male. This still leaves us with the question of answering whether or not one ought to be an alpha male. Now, if the definition of an alpha male is in any way different from an account of a man of virtue, then a PUA is making a claim in competition with philosophers like Socrates, Plato, Aristotle, the Stoics, and so on. Where the mentioned philosophers make the normative statement that a man ought to be a man of virtue, the PUA makes the normative claim that a man ought to be an alpha male. To those PUAs who wish to defend this thesis, well, good luck. But if they do not wish to refute the claims made by these philosophers, then the label of alpha male does not differ from the label of the man of virtue. If this is the case, then game would be the same as virtue ethics. So it is either the case that Socrates, Aristotle, Plato, the Stoics, and all other defenders of virtue ethics are wrong and PUAs are right, or PUAs are wrong. If PUAs are wrong, then it follows that one ought not become an alpha male, and so ought not pursue game. As I have yet to see a justified account from a PUA of what an alpha male is, I am forced to fall back to the account of alpha males I gave in my video on alpha males. As my account of what an alpha male is not the same as that of a man of virtue, and I assert that if virtue ethics is true, then it follows that one ought not become an alpha male. What I've just argued for, should not be construed that I am advocating for being a beta. What the argument suggests is that one should become a man of virtue and ignore the dichotomy of alpha and beta, as regardless of what each may be, neither is what one ought to be. What one ought to do is come to know the form of justice, the form of courage, the form of prudence, and the form of temperance through contemplation, and then put them into practice through habit. This is a valid proof, and I also consider it sound. But if a PUA wishes to argue, then he will need to demonstrate one of my premises false. But why don't we take a different approach when evaluating game? Let us ask ourselves, what kind of thing is game most similar to? Could it be said that game is similar to that which a politician does when he is seeking out votes? Could it be said that game is similar to the lawyer who is looking to get an acquittal for his client, or a salesman who is looking to make a sale? Well, yes, indeed. It appears like game is similar to all these things. So what is it that is practiced by all these activities? Rhetoric. Indeed, it appears like game is a kind of rhetoric. If this is true, then we need to ask ourselves, is rhetoric an art? Now, Plato's dialogue entitled Gorgias tackles this very question. Now, Gorgias was someone who is credited with having invented the occupation of taking money for instruction in rhetoric. So if we are ever going to see a good defense of rhetoric, it will surely come from Gorgias. Though I have no intention of recreating the argument that takes place between Socrates and Gorgias, let me give you what the discussion eventually settles on. After a long exchange, Socrates finally demonstrates that rhetoric is itself not an art of any sort, but merely that it is a knack. But a knack for what? Well, Socrates goes on to say that it is a knack for producing a certain gratification and pleasure. But what would this gratification and pleasure be for a PUA? Well, it could be one of three things. The first possibility is the banal pleasure of sex itself. The second possibility is the thrill of the chase. The third possibility is the consent itself. In all three cases, however, the PUA is a hedonist. Now, let us explore these three options. If the pleasure rests in the banal pleasure of sex, then it follows that the PUA would be indifferent to the woman with whom he would have sex. Such a PUA would attempt to maximize on pleasure and minimize on pain. As rejection is painful, this is something that would need to be minimized. The minimization of rejection is optimal with prostitutes, and therefore the logical activity for such a PUA would be to use prostitutes exclusively. To maximize on the instances of sexual encounters, his strategy should be to generate money and, find deals, as it were, with prostitutes. If the pleasure is the thrill of the chase, then the PUA is indifferent to the outcome of the chase. Since he too is a hedonist, he would minimize on pain and maximize on pleasure. As rejection is painful and he is indifferent to the outcome of the chase, then it follows he would never allow for rejection to occur by never making his intentions clear as to maintain plausible deniability. In essence, he would flirt and insinuate in the same way as a woman does. For such a PUA, he would only ever have sex if the woman initiates it first. This leaves us with the last scenario, the pleasure of getting consent itself. In this scenario, the PUA wishes to maximize on the number of times he acquires consent, but is ultimately indifferent to whether or not he has sex after consent is granted. In addition to this, he is not primarily interested in the chase, and as such would minimize on how long the chase takes. But what does it mean when we say that there is pleasure in acquiring consent? What sort of pleasure is it? Well, I posit that it is female validation, but more specifically, sexual viability. After all, if it was merely validation, then the source of that validation could be any number of things other than consent for sex. Equally, if it was general validation from women, then being in the friend zone would not be a problem, as the PUA would still get a pat on the head for being, well, a good friend. Now, if indeed sexual viability is what the PUA is after, then it follows that he is not confident in his own sexual viability. Now, can someone value validation originating from a source that he himself does not value? Well, surely not. After all, approval from someone who you consider beneath you yields no pleasure. Can you value validation from someone you consider your equal? No, you cannot. Because if your own opinion on a matter is not sufficient to validate you, then the opinion of someone equal to you necessarily will be insufficient as well. Take the example of, say, holding a guitar. If you do not have sufficient confidence that you are holding a guitar correctly, then you do not trust your own opinion on the matter. Someone you consider your peer on the matter cannot be trusted either, as your confidence in their opinion is of equal weight to your own opinion, which we already said you do not trust. From this, it follows that validation is only possible from someone you consider a superior. So, a PUA who gains pleasure from acquiring consent necessarily sees the woman from whom he seeks it as superior to him, as he seeks their validation and therefore confidence in his sexual viability. After all, once you gain the confidence in your sexual viability, you would no longer gain pleasure from gaining consent. If a PUA already has confidence in his sexual viability, then he could only desire pleasure from either the chase or the sexual act itself. But like we said earlier, if indeed the PUA derives this pleasure from sex, then he would best optimize his hedonistic desires through pursuing prostitutes, as that minimizes on the time it takes to get sex. Now, just look at Charlie Sheen. The man has celebrity and money. He could go out and pick up fairly easily. But the man still pays for whores. Why? Because it cuts through all the bullshit and pretense. This is also why you see all these scandals with CEOs and executives getting caught using company money on whores. These are the men that can have the ability to attract women through other methods, but they still go for whores. So, the logical conclusion of a game is either tiger blood and whores, or the thrill of the chase. But since there's little more to whores than handing over money for sex, this must mean that game, if indeed it is a subset of rhetoric, is a knack for chasing women that is outcome independent. So in this way, game, becomes a literal game. It's like a cat playing with a mouse for the shits and giggles, but the cat has no reason to do so, other than the activity itself is pleasurable. The pleasure in game then becomes like the pleasure of swinging a piece of wood at a ball and running around in a circle, which we call baseball. It is the pleasure of spinning in your chair until you get dizzy because, for whatever reason, you find that sort of thing pleasurable. Game has no ends for which it aims, and no inherent good at which it leads. And due to this, it is neither an art or knowledge. Now, to close this video, I want to tackle a certain accusation that hostile PUAs launch at MGTOW. They say that, well, MGTOW just can't get laid. Let us unpack this interesting little accusation and get to the delicious confession the accuser is making. To do this, we need to work with the system of beliefs that a PUA considers true. The PUA asserts that he can get laid. The PUA asserts that he gets laid because he has game. Now, any man can pay a prostitute and have sex. This entails that one way of getting laid is by paying for sex. Now, the PUA cannot possibly mean that MGTOW are incapable of paying for sex. He must mean something else. What the PUA must mean is that MGTOW cannot convince a woman to have sex with them via rhetoric. From this, it follows that the accuser sees value in getting consent. Now, earlier we argued that you can only get value from consent if it is validation of sexual viability. Now, for the accusation, you just can't get laid, to hold any weight in the mind of the accuser, he must currently hold the belief that consent from a woman is valuable. This entails that the accuser at present sees women above him, as validation can only come from a superior, as we argued before. From this, it follows that the accuser lacks confidence in his own sexual viability. After all, if he considered himself sexually viable, he would no longer see getting a woman's consent as valuable. This is why guys who have had a lot of sex and are confident about themselves tend to downplay sex, call it overrated, or simply lose interest in it. But most importantly, guys who have confidence in their sexual viability see that it really means nothing, and so would find no reason to shame someone who they believe does not have it. The confession of a PUA making this accusation is that he does not have confidence in his own sexual viability. But it gets a little funnier than this. You see, earlier we said that the PUA makes a claim to possessing game, and that game is that through which he can get women to consent. Now, this itself implies that the PUA sees himself as terminally sexually unviable. The argument goes as follows. If you feel inherently sexually viable, then it follows that you believe that there are women who want to fuck you for no other reason than that you are sexually viable. Now, since a PUA considers game as knowledge, then it would follow that a lack of game is ignorance. Since he claims to have game, he claims to have this knowledge. But this means that someone gains sexual viability through possession of the knowledge of game. But game must be enacted, as it could hardly be said that someone who has read PUA material but then sits quietly in the corner of a club will all of a sudden have women flock to them. So if game must be enacted, and a PUA believes they gain sexual viability through game, then it follows that they must believe that they are terminally sexually unviable when they are not putting game into action. This means that a PUA must believe that he is inherently worthless as far as his sexual viability to women, and he must overcome this worthlessness through a learned skill. The PUA looks at a woman and thinks to himself, she is worth having sex with, while secretly saying to himself, but I have to apply this art I call game, because she will not see me as worth having sex with, as I am inherently worthless. Thanks for listening. Go team.